Hello again, book lovers. I guess it's the same with books as it is with films. There are certain ones that you really want to experience and you set aside the time to do it and you hope they live up to your expectations. And that was the case with Me and a Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman. So there's 600 plus pages here, all about the medieval world, centred on France largely, and hung around the life of Enguerrand de Cussy the 7th. Did it live up to my expectations? Absolutely. This is a real treasure of a book. The idea of framing the life of the century around the life of one man didn't sound initially convincing to me, but you know, he was born 1340, died just at the end of the century. So the first part of the book we got a lot of background about what life was like, what the customs were like in the 14th century, plus the essential politicking and battling and rivalrying and all the usual Game of Thrones stuff. And the second half follows rather more closely the life of Enguerrand, who pops up propitiously in many an important field of action, as he was a very important person. He was taken as a hostage by the English and lived there for many years, where he married one of Edward III's daughters, then returned to France, went on many campaigns, so many internal battles between Picardy and Normandy and Burgundy and Brittany and all these places. Navarra enters into it, of course, Savoy enters into it. So this France is a kind of, similar to Italy, I guess, an amalgam of states, not yet welded into a country under a king, although nominally that's what it is. Well, that's the framework. What we get in the book is, following the trunk of the life of this one man, we branch off at just about every possible point to explore medieval life. The clothes people wore, the food people ate, the things you were entitled to according to your rank, plus, of necessity, a recap of all the great events of, as the subtitle of this book puts it, the calamitous 14th century. Because there was Black Death, there were internal battles all over Europe. At the end of the century we got the Ottomans coming over, but all that's stored up for the future, from our perspective. So with a hefty recommendation, I say, if you're going to read one book on the 14th century, it's going to be this one. It's nice and thick, nice and full, and as with the best history books, it leaves you feeling that you know more than you did when you started reading it. What do we find along the way then? We will find the nascent idea of a trade union from the guilds. We will find the origins of the schism in the church, which eventually became Catholic and Protestant. But here we are at the time of two rival popes, even three for a while. And in general, the book is full of delicious little insights. We even find out what was in Charles V of France's library as his three sons fight to divvy it up. There are descriptions of medieval banquets where the leading knights present the dish at the end of a lance, which can't have been that easy. And the nobles are treated to stage works with really quite advanced and realistic sound effects of battles and storms and the like. We also find some proto-Marxist revolts. Quite a few bands of disgruntled poor people in Italy, France, England, of course. The Peasants' Revolt falls in this time frame. And we find the beginning of the idea of sorcery being heretical, as the witch trials are about to begin at the end of the century. Until then, of course, messing around with herbs and spices and spells wasn't considered to be particularly anti-Christian. But here we are entering into a time when the popes and the institutions are threatened by Huss and Wycliffe and the like. Anti-Semitism is a huge ongoing theme. It seems that whenever anything bad happened, blame the Jews was the initial response, and it was backed up wholeheartedly by local populaces. The attitude to war is interesting as well. We're still in the age of chivalry, kind of coming to the end of it. according to a lot of pessimistic commentators of the time. And the idea was that the best knights would go out with their trumpets blazing and their crests very visible, and they would get the glory in the battle. The idea of reconnoitring terrain didn't occur to them. The clash was everything, Tuchman says. So a quick word on the writing while we're mentioning the author. There's some marvellous little snippets of congealed historical wisdom. The unfair advantage of the written word triumphs in the end, we learn on page 514. And on page 342 we find somebody acting, quote, with the contempt of colonial governors for the natives. And what else do we pick up from the book? Well, a lot. The attitude to children, which is pretty much non-existent. Pointy shoes, they crop up quite a lot. They are loved by the rich and despised by the poor. We learn about figures that have been half forgotten by history, although if you were around in the 14th century they'd be household names. Depending where you lived, you've got John Gerson, Gerard Groot, Thomas à Kempis, the Breton knight de Guesclin, Wenceslas IV, the drunken sot. All kinds of people popping up in the pageant. As so often, high-level politics seems to be the warring of families, powerful families against each other. And there are a lot of powerful women figures that crop up in the story, surprisingly, as we're dealing with the 14th century. St. Catherine of Siena being a good case in point. And as always, we get mini-biographies of all these people, highlighting, to my mind, the more interesting aspects of their lives, rather than where and when they were born and died, who they married, etc., etc. So this is a book full of knowledge, full of history, full of insights. Here's one little sentence near the end that drew my attention. Elementary schools, quote, disappeared until modern times, end quote. I'd like to investigate that. What was the elementary school in a typical English village in the 14th century and before? Were they anything like schools that we know? Questions, questions, but this is a book largely of answers to pretty much anything you'd like to know about that part of the Middle Ages. As we're centred in France, we can scoot off on warring missions to Savoy, to England, to Scotland, to Spain, where they sent a couple of the companies. These were the people left over from the Crusades. They didn't have anything to do, so they just terrorised the local villages wherever they were. Well, how about sending them off on a crusade? That was one way of doing it. And there's a complicated episode where they get sent down to deal with Pedro the Cruel. The English are involved. Let's not forget, Aquitaine was English for a large part of this time, as was Calais, the last bastion. It's all there. It's all being fought over. Who wins? Who loses? Well, we know because it's history. But you can immerse yourself back into the 14th century with this book and play it all out again. It really is excellent entertainment.